My name is Susan Barosorio. I'm on behalf of the faculty and staff at the Center for Latin American Studies. I welcome you to the Charlas con Café. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today. Alexis Work is a PhD candidate in the School of Government and Public Policy, and she works on comparative politics, and she also has a minor in methods. She's broadly interested in the conditions under which gender equality policy is advanced and effectively implemented. Her research focuses on the relationship between government and non-government actors in combating gender-based violence. And Alexis's other recent research aims to better understand public opinion and reporting trends of gender-based violence in Latin America. So I will turn this over to you, Alexis. Thank you so much for talking to us today about your work.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to present my research to everyone. These are going to be this presentation is a couple chapters of my dissertation, one chapter that over time has morphed into two. So I'm going to kind of present both of those. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
The PowerPoint. Let's see. Oops. Can you see the PowerPoint? Not the.
Yeah, it's good. It's perfect.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm calling my dissertation right now is Instituting Equality, Women's Policy Agencies, and the Fight Against Gender-Based Violence. So what I'm focused on are these institutions around the world, and there are several in Latin America called women's policy agencies, and the role that they play not only in promoting gender equality, but the role they play in affecting gender-based violence policy adoption and implementation. So I'll start by talking about, oh, sorry, my slide changer wasn't working the way I thought it would. I'm good now. So I'll start by talking about women's policy agencies and what they are in the first place. So they're one type of response to gender inequality, and they're a little bit broad in terms of how they're defined. They were first really articulated or promoted at the Fourth World Conference on Women that was held in Beijing in 1995. So a lot of people refer to Beijing as the landmark moment or conference at which these agencies were promoted. So they were recommended as organizations that would be built within a federal government structure to mainstream gender issues or serve as kind of the principal coordinating body on issues of gender equality. So WPAs would be responsible for essentially just helping organize, plan, coordinate a country's response to gender inequality. All gender issues would go through this agency. So in response to this, many countries created WPAs. And there are some things that we've learned about these agencies, but there's still also a lot that we don't know. So I'm going to talk here about what we do know, what studies have been conducted on WPAs and the effect that they have on gender equality. So some of the biggest studies that have been done find that, like large N studies, I should say, find that WPAs might facilitate communication between advocates, political advocates like feminist groups, and then state actors like legislators. So these studies have found that mostly these agencies just kind of serve an intermediary role between advocates in a country, social movements, anyone kind of fighting for gender equality on the ground, and then legislators, people embedded in the government. They serve an important channeling function by helping get the message across to legislators, but then they also have this skill that studies have recognized, which is framing gendered issues for a government audience. So kind of translating movement demands or demands by advocates into policy language that legislators can understand and pass and then eventually implement to help promote gender equality over time. So One thing that is persistent in this literature is that women's policy agencies are defined really broadly. Maybe as you've gathered so far, they're kind of just big agencies that deal with gender equality. There's no real specifics other than that. They're federal agencies that deal with gender. So they can exist in way different formats in different areas in the government and perform different functions. Gender equality is a large topic, so they might deal with a whole number of issues. And then additionally, the resources and tools that WPAs have at their disposal might vary. So a lot of research at this point doesn't really take into account what the variance in resources might be and the impact of that variance. So I want to kind of continue talking about this, what we don't know about WPAs, because this is kind of what I'm trying to find out in my research. So detailed research on WPAs has been done to look at resources, but this is mostly in OECD countries in Europe. So this context doesn't really speak to other regions. And one kind of clue that WPAs might have an impact, or that it's at least worth studying what impact they have, is that they persist over time in context. So after 1995, many of these agencies were established and they continue to persist. So they're still around for a reason. And I kind of want to, part of the reason that I do this research is I want to figure out why they're still around, what their purpose currently is. And again, because of study focused in Europe, we don't really know much about WPA resources and the variation in WPA resources outside of Europe. So what I'm doing in this part of my dissertation is looking at how variation in resources and attributes of women's policy agencies affects policy adoption. So I focus on WPAs in Latin America, as you may have guessed. So nearly every country in Latin America has a WPA. There are some exceptions, including Bolivia, and Brazil now has kind of something that could be considered a WPA, but also could not, because it's been really shrunk in recent years. But other than those two countries, nearly every country in the region has a WPA that's autonomous and that's dedicated specifically to gender equality. And all of these WPAs have persisted over time. So I included a screen grab here just to kind of show you what you can find if you look at a WPA website. This is from Chile's WPA, which has been around starting this year for 31 years. So it has persisted over time, and you can see that there's different programs and reports that are offered by these agencies. So they are active. And I also want to look at WPAs in Latin America because the region has a record of gender equality movements and formal responses to gender equality that kind of set it apart and ahead from other regions. So the region has the Belém do Pará Treaty, which was signed in 1994, or created and ratified by most countries in 1994, which specifically addresses violence against women. There are no global treaties that do this, so this is kind of a unique regional treaty. And then the region has also taken steps to formally criminalize femicide and gender-based violence at a higher level than other regions have. So what I want to look at is how WPAs kind of facilitate this type of response, both policies against gender-based violence to combat gender-based violence, and then those policies carried out in practice. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about my policy focus here. So I'm looking at WPAs in this region, and I'm focused on their ability to respond to gender-based violence or impact gender-based violence. So I want to characterize this issue mainly as a global problem because it's not just a regional problem. It exists around the world. 1 in 3 women experience physical violence at the hands of a partner or ex-partner at some point in their life, according to UN Women. And according to Women's Stats, which is the picture that I've included here, the map is from Women's Stats, there is no country in which women are completely physically secure. So there are a lot of settings in which women have low levels of physical security or lack physical security around the world. So this remains a really persistent problem. And countries in Latin America, as I said in the last slide, have responses to this issue, but impunity remains pretty high. So implementation and actual prosecution of people who carry out gender-based violence is low. So that is a problem in the region and around the world. But that's just one thing I wanted to highlight. And WPAs in Latin America often work closely with the issue of gender-based violence. So most of them have programming on gender-based violence. And this is kind of an area that I think WPAs in this region specialize in. So what I want to do with my research is focus on their ability to kind of work with these issues in terms of influencing policy. Okay, so now I'm going to talk through my theory a little bit for this part of the dissertation. So my idea is that different resources matter for different stages of the policy process. So 3 of the main resources that I focus on throughout my dissertation are 1, which is kind of obvious, but budget. So the funding available to WPAs is important for the policy process. Also, the agenda of WPAs is important. What kind of programming they're carrying out, what issues it's focused on, and what it's focused towards. So they may have public-facing programs like advocacy campaigns, but they may also have kind of working groups with legislators or policymakers that are geared towards making, including a gendered perspective in all policy and making better anti-gender-based violence policy. The third resource I consider is a little bit different than what you would think of as an average resource like a budget, but it's connections to domestic feminist movements and advocates. So I think this is a huge resource because having this connection can help these WPAs better understand the nature of issues and problems on the ground and what kind of solutions are necessary. And will help combat gender-based violence. So understanding the nature of the problem on the ground in the context of a country is particularly important. So these are the resources that I look at. And overall, I put forward a pretty broad hypothesis. So where WPAs have more of these resources, anti-gender-based violence policy that is adopted will address gender-based violence in a more comprehensive way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in a few slides. So one thing I want to mention about this hypothesis is that when I initially created it or put my theory together, I kind of left room for some different elements to this. So some of these resources might be additive, taken together. They may enhance the ability of a WPA to impact outcomes. But other resources may actually work only in tandem with others and not be as useful without equal amounts of a second resource. So this is kind of confusing, I guess. I hope I'm saying it in a way that makes sense, but I wanted to consider how resources might work together and how they might be necessary for one another in doing this research. So this is kind of an exploratory hypothesis. I'm really looking to see how these things come together to impact, in this case, policy adoption. Okay, so for this, my research approach was to do case studies of both Argentina and Colombia, and I focus on the period between 1990 and 2015 because this is around the time that WPAs are established and major landmark anti-gender-based violence policy is ratified. So both of these countries have autonomous and permanent WPAs starting in 1995. And they both have first and second wave responses to gender-based violence. And that's just my characterization of anti-GBV policy. There's kind of 2 major waves of policy in the region, and each country has that. And they each have similar populations and population density. And as noted by international organization reports on progress, they both have recent histories with political violence. And I can talk about that more in questions too. So for my data on WPA resources, I use several different ways to get information on the resources that WPAs have available. So first, I looked at the Wayback Machine to find website information from these WPAs. Often this just consisted of finding mission statements, any kind of legal foundation to the WPAs, like their main areas of focus, because they do change over time. So I use this to find out that information directly from the WPAs themselves. And then I also use reports from international organizations, both the UN's reports. They have some follow-up reports on the Beijing 1995 conference to track progress on WPA creation and strength. So they have two reports, one 5 years out and one 10 years out. And then also reports from the OAS on the Belém do Pará convention and the progress on that in the years after its passage. So those are in 2008 and 2012 respectively. And then where they're available, which actually I should just say in Argentina, there are some shadow reports to the OAS by domestic NGOs kind of writing on WPA progress and progress in the fight against gender-based violence. So I've looked at these shadow reports where they're available to get information on WPA resources from the perspective of domestic organizations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my dependent variable, which is policy adoption. So the outcome I'm looking at here is the anti-gender-based violence policy that is adopted. So I got policy information from the ECLAC, or CELAC in Spanish. They have a database on policy that addresses gender-based violence. So what I've done is collect every single piece of legislation on gender-based violence in these countries and go through it. So what I've done is code each article of the policy to capture kind of what it's geared towards doing, what the purpose of each particular article is in this policy. So I'm calling these instruments. So each unit of an analysis is an article, and I'm going to refer to it as a policy instrument. And so I've coded these instruments for what their purpose is in combating gender-based violence. So I went through these pieces of legislation and coded articles for the instrument type. So I'm going to talk about the instrument types now. So these aren't coming from nowhere. There's a little bit of research that talks about instruments and creates a typology of instruments in the context of gender equality policy. So the first four on this screen are some instruments that have already been discussed and created by existing research. So I'll talk about them briefly, but I also have some charts after my presentation. So if you want to read more about these or see some examples, I'm totally able to show those to you. So prohibitive instruments are probably the most straightforward when we think about anti-gender-based violence policy. This is policy outlining criminal acts of gender-based violence, rape, things like this. It's kind of obvious, but there are more prohibitive instruments over time as policymakers recognize additional forms of harm. There are incentive instruments, which technically provide incentives to nudge or incentivize behavior. So these generally I coded when policy provided any kind of service or assistance to women seeking help from the government. So maybe stepping forward to report, looking for shelter, temporary shelter. This would be an incentive instrument if it's built into an anti-gender-based violence policy. Then there are learning instruments, which serve to require training or teaching of state agents, which could be police officers, security officers, legislators, on the issue of gender-based violence. And then finally, symbolic instruments, which involve things that aren't concrete, of course, but are symbolic gestures to kind of state a country's stance or disposition towards gender-based violence. So an example of this is signing an international treaty. So in coding instruments, I found a lot of different elements of policy that didn't necessarily fit with this framework. So I added a few more that I'm going to talk about. The first is neutral policy instruments. So for articles that didn't necessarily serve as a incentive to women, but weren't necessarily a disincentive either, I coded as neutral policy instruments. So this could be, an example of this is a requirement for certain amounts of evidence in a trial, or a requirement that certain public officials report suspicion of acts of violence. So things that aren't necessarily an incentive to share or report. Then there are definition instruments. So these I applied to articles that define types of crimes or types of harm. So some policies contained more language discussing forms of gender-based violence. Sorry, my dog's whining a little bit, she's okay. And then there are delegative policy instruments, which are articles that identify and delegate tasks or programs, any kind of activity to specific agencies or actors within the government. So I coded these when I saw them too. So this is how I coded my policy to get an idea of my dependent variable. Okay, so now I would like to kind of transition and talk about these case studies and what I found in all of these reports about the level of resources that was available to each of these WPAs. So first I'll talk about Colombia. So Colombia has the Presidential Council for Women's Equity, which initially began in 1991, but was first kind of considered more of a youth, family, and women agency. So not specifically geared towards women, but more geared towards women as part of the traditional family unit. But in 1995, after the Beijing conference, they changed this to be just focused on women. So I'm going to talk about budget first, and there's not a lot to talk about for either country here. It was really difficult to find information on budget for these. So I included a quote from a report, but this is generally what I found for both countries, which is that there isn't budget information specific enough to report that level of funding. So there's social spending, information on social spending, but not at the level of the WPA to say how much they were actually able to spend, how much they were budgeted on a year-to-year basis. More recently, in the last 5-6 years, there's great budget information, but at this time, there really isn't much. And then when it is reported, the budget for the CPEM, I'll call it, is lower than the gender equality budget for other government programs, such as larger ministries, gender equality programming. So that's really quite low. Okay, so I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the agenda at the CPEM. So I'm splitting this into two kind of areas that make up the agenda here, because the first is focus areas, public awareness campaigns, kind of the CPEM's outward facing programming, so or towards the public. So there's several programs throughout the time period that I study that the CPEM begins and has. There's some awareness campaigns that start in 2002. In 2006, importantly, the CPEM starts the Observatory on Colombian Women, which is a data collection arm of the CPEM, and it's dedicated towards collecting better information on levels of gender-based violence around the country. Later in my time frame, in 2013, they established a national hotline that provides information on gender-based violence and domestic violence. And then in 2014, they create kind of a body within the CPEM to provide better attention to women victims of armed conflict. This becomes a new priority for the CPEM. It's one of the things that the international organizations critique a lot about the CPEM. So we see a response here in 2014. Another part of the agenda is their inward facing. So the CPEM's advisory role to the government, to the presidency, executive office, but also to the legislature. So in 2003, the CPEM oversaw the signing of the National Agreement for the Equality Between Women and Men, which I see as kind of a formal like ERA type agreement. And it was signed by several legislators, the president, as well as different non-governmental organizations. In 2006, they created the Observatory on Gender Affairs, which is a body within the CPEM that was dedicated to training and informing legislators and government officials on best practices in terms of responding to gender-based violence. And this becomes kind of a main part of the CPEM's function, which is this advisory capacity to the government. So this agenda grows over time. The CPEM kind of grows in terms of its focus on gender-based violence. And it's got pretty strong outward focus as well as inward focus on its agenda. Okay, and then I want to briefly discuss connections to feminist movements for the CPEM. So they exhibit a pretty low level of partnership with domestic civil society organizations and local feminist movements. Actually, reports by the UN and OAS both note that the CPEM has a good record of cooperation with international organizations throughout its tenure, but not really a lot of local cooperation with feminist movements. So this does become a bigger priority for the CPEM later on their website. They list supporting women's organizations as a priority. However, the most recent OAS report on the CPEM notes that the agenda of the CPEM is carried out with pretty low participation of movements and NGOs. So overall, relatively low connections. Okay, now I'm going to transition over to discussing Argentina. So Argentina founded the National Council for Women in 1991, has since changed names, but it remains the National Council for Women through 2015. So I'll refer to it as the CNM. The budget for the CNM, where information is available, is really low. And actually, a shadow report provided some good insight on the budget here. And it indicated that in 2007, the budget for the CNM was cut by 80%. So it was really drastic. The information that is available on the budget for this agency is shows that it's really low, kind of alarmingly low, possibly too low to really accomplish very much. So there are budget cuts throughout this time period. I'll move on to the CNM's agenda. So I also divided this into these two categories of more of their outward focus. So there's a lot of programs that the CNM is responsible for that are a little bit more temporary. The one that is the least temporary, and I think created a lot of long-lasting connections, local connections, is the Federal Plan for Women. So this federal plan involved working with and establishing local women's resource centers and funding programs between both the CNM and local non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. So there's a lot of collaboration here to help create resources for women. It's unclear how many of these kind of working projects had to do specifically with gender-based violence, but having these women's resource centers is certainly an advancement. So then the CNM has temporary campaigns in 2006 and 2008, just to create awareness about gender-based violence, what it is and how you can seek help. They also founded a national hotline in 2015 towards the end of the time period that I'm looking at. So I included some underlines here to talk about these two final points, because these are things that didn't necessarily happen. However, they were assigned to the CNM within this time frame. So they were tasked with creating a registry of incidents of violence against women, keeping data on this so that they can have that information to provide to legislators and the public, and then also tasked with opening shelters and centers that provide services to women in need of that kind of help who are facing gender-based violence. So these are things that didn't necessarily come to fruition, but were listed as tasks assigned to the CNM. So they may not have necessarily had the resources to carry that out. So in terms of the CNM's advisory role inwards towards the government, probably the strongest program that they had was from 2002 to 2003. And this is similar to in Colombia, their advisory arm of the CPEM. This was a network for confronting domestic violence, for creating kind of best practices to deal with domestic violence and to educate legislators and people in the government about this. And it also involves some collaboration with non-government organizations. They also promulgated a protocol for police on intervention in situations of family violence. Aside from this, there's not a lot. So Argentina, in international organization reports, their formal role is stated as advising legislation with impact on women, which is basically the role of a WPA. So this is pretty broad. There's not a lot of specific information on things that they did. And then later in 2009, after the passage of additional anti-gender-based violence legislation, the CPEM was assigned, or sorry, the CNM was assigned to create a national plan for action on prevention, assistance, and eradication of violence against women. So this didn't actually take place, but it's something that was broadly assigned to the CNM. Overall, I would say that the CNM had better connections to feminist movements throughout this time period. As I said previously, the federal plan for women involved a lot of collaboration with local groups. And there was a campaign in 2008, I mentioned on the previous slide, it's called the Right to Live Without Violence Awareness Campaign. This involved grassroots organizations. And then later in the 2010s, the CNM kind of created a system to certify NGOs that dealt with gender-based violence that apply to be certified. So this isn't entirely positive, but it is a way to create it was a way for the CNM to create a database of organizations locally and at the national level that also deal with gender-based violence. So to kind of create awareness about everything that's available. And even despite this, the OAS's report in 2012 recommended better openings for participation of feminist movements of these kinds of organizations in policy design and implementation. So while there are good connections, it seems that maybe they weren't as strong later in the time period. Okay, so now I want to talk about the result, right? The dependent variable of anti-gender-based violence policy. So before I go into it, I just wanted to kind of share with you the major years in which anti-gender-based violence policy was passed. So I'm calling first wave policy that addresses gender-based violence in the context of domestic violence. A lot of this policy passed in Latin America in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then following this by quite a bit, there's second wave policy, which is policy in the area that passed. And instead of looking just at combating gender-based violence in the family context, in the household context, it addressed this problem as being related to broader gender inequality and violence resulting from practiced gender inequality, not only in the home, but in society. So this legislation is more comprehensive, and most of it passed in the late 2000s to 2010s in Latin America. So I just wanted to give you the dates here. Argentina, 1994 and 2009. and then Colombia, 1996 and 2008. So I made some graphs of these instruments over time, and I made them step graphs so you can see exactly when a policy indicates when a policy created more instruments or it contained more instruments. So I want to highlight a couple things about these here. These are the primary instruments that I mentioned. I had very few symbolic instruments, so I left that off here. But this shows the number of instruments over my time period that fall into each category. And across this, I think a main takeaway is that Colombia sees more instruments in each of the types: prohibitive, incentive, and learning. But we see similar trends. So we see similar trends at time in which policy is passed. You can see years in which a lot of instruments were added. Kind of in this second wave, you see a lot of incentive instruments, and I think that's pretty important. So those aren't the only forms of legislation that were passed. There are some others that kind of make up these steps in the graph, and they are usually dealing with trafficking, or maybe are related to combat or human rights in the context of armed conflict in the case of Colombia, or are about sex work or forced prostitution. Okay, so I want to move on to talk a little bit about my alternate instruments that I kind of created while I was coding this legislation. So I think the results here are particularly interesting because we see that Colombia also has a way higher share of both definition and delegative instruments, which suggests that their legislation has much deeper information about types of harm, defining harm, but then also assigning certain tasks throughout the government and to localities on in terms of this policy and who's going to do what, who's responsible for which instruments, carrying certain things out. And then neutral here isn't super informative. We just see a higher number of neutral instruments in Colombia, which I think is reflective of this overall trend. So I want to talk about this in the context of both of these things taken together to kind of talk through what this means to me right now. And I'm still working through this, so I'm really curious for all of your thoughts on this. But overall, funding for gender equality is low. So there's not a lot to really compare here. I think that this is probably a trend that exists across the region and around the globe. Funding to support gender equality is quite low. And this likely hinders WPA performance, though I don't really have a lot of variation in budget here to look at. So there's some other similarities I want to mention while I'm talking about funding that were important that I noticed in reports across in both Argentina and Colombia. So for both countries, reports noted really uneven levels of service outside of urban areas and at the local level. So this is a problem that seems to persist throughout this time period. And then additionally, there's pretty low levels in each country of training of personnel, of legislators on this issue of gender-based violence. So most training is voluntary, or there aren't really serious training programs. So these are kind of the similarities I found across reports and wanted to share. So now I want to talk about findings in terms of the agenda, this resource that, that women's policy agencies can have, what they're responsible for doing. So overall, having a specific agenda seems to help WPAs effectively communicate and advise on policy. We see Colombia having a pretty specific inward-facing agenda throughout this time period, and they have a dedicated arm to advise legislators. And I think that as a result, we see more policy instruments over time that are more specific. They address gender-based violence in a more specific way across different categories. So vague and temporary advising efforts might not have as much effect on policy adoption. And delegation to specific subgroups, having more permanent established groups to advise on policy can improve the functioning of a WPA and their level of influence on the content of policy. So I also feel like one of the findings here is, this is kind of an interesting finding I'm still working with, which is that anti-gender-based legislation may also influence WPAs themselves. So this kind of goes back to my other instruments on delegation, but things like this could also affect the workings of WPAs. So depending on whether they delegate to WPAs or they just give WPAs a broad prescription, such as some of the things that Argentina was tasked with but didn't actually carry out, this type of how legislation is written affects those responsibilities of WPAs and how they're able to carry them out. Okay. So the final section of my findings that I want to talk about is social movements. So here, I didn't really find a strong role of social movement presence in terms of impacting policy adoption. It seems like social movement presence can help WPAs advise on policy in a more meaningful way. And I have some evidence, anecdotal evidence about this that I can discuss afterwards if you'd like. I think there's still a serious role that these movements can play at the policy adoption level, but it's really important that WPAs have a strong and well-established line of communication with policymakers and have that as one of their agenda items in order to impact policy adoption. And my suspicion is that in this context, these movements might play a larger role in promoting implementation. Just after my time period of study ends, we see a lot of protest and social movement activity independently in Argentina that actually leads to a lot of policy implementation, where policy had existed but not really been taken seriously. So I don't want this finding of this study to be that social movements or feminist movements don't matter, but I think that they might not matter as much for this step, or they matter through these WPAs, whereas their role changes a lot when it comes to other stages of policy, like policy implementation. Okay, so I want to quickly discuss some areas for improvement that I'm focused on right now, and also some directions for additional research that I would like to, or that I do plan to address in my dissertation, and then some that maybe kind of go beyond my dissertation. But in these chapters of my dissertation, I'm still looking for more detailed data on budget information. I think that'll give a little bit better insight into what these budgets looked like over time. Also, I'm still looking for better shadow reports where I can find them, information from domestic groups on the activities of these WPAs. And then I think it would be really interesting in this study to incorporate additional years to look at ongoing impact from connections to feminist movements, because I think looking at this through 2020 or even through 2018 could provide some really interesting insight on how stronger WPAs with good agendas, or strong agendas, use those connections to domestic movements to help impact policy adoption. So in this dissertation, what I plan to do is include a regional level study of WPAs and policy instruments. So I'm working on this now. I'm working on the data part and the writing part, and I haven't really got to analysis, but this is another component of my dissertation I hope to incorporate to better understand this. And then also, I would like to evaluate later in my dissertation policy implementation, because this is a stage that I don't address here, but is crucial. And I think that there are a lot of contexts in which policy is not well implemented. And then finally, I want to look a little bit more deeply into how these international organization reports are written, to kind of evaluate what their recommendations look like for different countries and what that might mean for progress. So that's what I have right now. That's my current, where my research stands. And I hope that I hope it was mostly clear and straightforward, and I'm happy to accept questions or talk about this, and any feedback you have is really appreciated.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Alexis, for that interesting research and such a clear talk. Could you end the share screen? Perfect. And then we can all see each other. Also, thanks very much for staying perfectly within time. That's wonderful. So we have a good amount of time for comments, questions. If anybody wants to, yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Hi, Alexis. Thanks for, well, I see that I have light in the back, so we can barely see my face, but thanks for a great presentation and very informative. And coincidentally, I want to go to Colombia I'm going to Colombia in July to see how the interaction of social movements with these agencies for racial equality in Colombia, how is the language of the movement is filtering to these agencies, because I'm a linguistic anthropologist, right? So my work has always been, my focus has always been on Brazil. And it was fascinating to hear all these things that you said, especially this connection between social movements and how they can act from within these agencies, right? And so I have a question and a comment about the Brazilian situation that you mentioned. My question is, did you see in Colombia any like intersection between the gender policy with racial equality policies? It was anything jumped from your observations, or that's my, what can you help me with the Colombia situation, right? So that the other thing that in Brazil, when I did research in Brazil in 2018, and this is July, before Bolsonaro, right? People are already fearing that he would defund these agencies for racial equality and also the women's. He actually put Damares Alves in the women's thing. And the first thing that she did is she said that now women in Brazil would wear pink and boys would wear blue. I don't know if you know about that. That's one of the first things that emerged when he took position, put this evangelical woman to lead the human rights and gender equality and racial equality agency in Brazil. Then it was just to have an idea. So when I interview people within the Ministério, Brazil has what we call Ministry of Planejamento e Orçamento. That basically, this is the agency that does the budgeting thing for all these other agencies of the whole government apparatus. While they're already talking within these Black activists who are part of the Ministério, the minister, right? But since they are permanent employees, they couldn't be fired by Bolsonaro. But what they are doing there is they're acting from within the agency, doing what they call transversal, starting to influence all these other agencies from the budgeting agency to influence also the language of the policy. And this is focus where, for example, managed to implement the racial committees in Brazil, the racial verification committees. So my question is, do you, then it's how feasible it is for us, for you as a researcher, for me, to tap into this, more into the internal aspects of these aids, what's happening internally, not just, that's I think that's gonna be my challenge, but anyway, that's just want to share the same interest. I'm very fascinated by your work. I think it's extremely important, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Should I answer now to this question? And
yeah, I think.
Okay, cool. So thank you so much for your insight and comments. I think there are a lot of similarities here, and what's happening in Brazil is definitely an example of a WPA that's kind of gone in a completely different direction from some of these others, which have been more geared towards equality. This one's really been turned into kind of an antagonistic agency. So to answer your first question about in Colombia with racial equality and gender equality, a major critique that I actually ran into that existed in both of the reports from the OAS, these reports are actually quite, I don't know, I want to call them sassy, but that's not the right word. They're they're harsh. And one way that this report consistently critiqued Colombia was to say that there remains a serious problem in terms of attending to Afro-Latino communities in Colombia and areas in which armed conflict was very strong, saying that the CPEM really has failed in terms of addressing people's issues and their specific issues in those areas. So I guess this isn't good, but the only place in which I ran into that intersection was to find that, you know, the response hasn't really been adequate in that area. Yeah, so I think that this was definitely a current challenge of the CPEM to start focusing on these issues. And I think in recent years, it's become more of their priority, like the armed conflict part of their agenda. It's a growing priority, but it's still kind of one of their weaknesses. In terms of the activity within the WPA or within like government agencies, I haven't heard of what's going on in Brazil with these activists. This is super interesting, and this is definitely something that I want to look at in my own research, but I haven't found a lot of information in terms of what's going on within these agencies, aside from just whether or not leadership has former movement experience. And that's more present later on after the time period that I study.
I'll be happy to introduce you, to put you in contact with these two people that I worked with in this ministry that I tell you. They are there and they're being very active, and it'll be great for you. And they'll be happy to, they're very open to contribute to it. They contribute a lot to my work since 2018. And so let me know. Yeah, let's talk later, and then I can put you in touch with them.
That sounds great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you. I like your presentation very much. You did a great job. I have a question. Have you seen any WPA involvement or activity in regards to the movement of the decriminalization of abortion in Colombia? It seems like that's becoming more of a transnational movement between Argentina and Mexico. And I was wondering if you've come across those statistics in your research.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit more to the situation in Argentina since it's already kind of come to fruition, but there's some really good research that kind of influenced some of my thinking on this topic that directly addressed the pro-abortion movement in Argentina and kind of their connections with the government. So one thing that was pointed out that I think is really important is that these movements, these feminist movements, don't necessarily have incentives to work with government agencies. It can actually be a disincentive, especially in cases where WPAs are not fully pro-gender equality. Say in the case of Brazil currently, that's a good example where movements probably wouldn't gain from cooperating, and finding that cooperation can be really important. I think that the ties between these movements can really help influence, traction. But I haven't looked specifically at the pro-choice movement and how they interact with WPAs. Colombia is going to be a really interesting case to watch, and I haven't read much about it yet. But yeah, I think that connection will be very interesting to watch as we go forward. I know it's not the perfect answer to your question because I don't focus as much on the abortion movement, but there's a lot to look at there.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, Stephen, go ahead, please.
Hi, Alexis. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think your work's really fascinating. Just out of curiosity, and I'm sorry if this question, the answer to this might be implicit in the observation that you're making, but I wonder whether you in terms of the sort of stated goals of the social movements, and obviously dependent on their variable connection with the implementation of policy, I wonder the correlation that you made between the sort of the adoption of policy instruments over time being similar across the time frame that you're looking at. I wonder if you found that there was also a correlation between sort of the activity of social movements within your countries in question that sort of lined up with that time frame narrative.
That's a really interesting question. I think there are some things that I'm quite familiar with in terms of social movements during this time period, but at the same time, that's an area that I think from the side of social movements, I can still do a little bit more to get better information on. A lot of the movements had a pretty strong role in promoting this first wave of policy and also promoting the creation of these WPAs at the time. But other than that, I'm not super sure about what their activities were during the 2000s, and that's what I'm especially curious about. But knowing afterwards, I think the case I know best is Argentina. After 2015, participation by people affiliated with social movements and just supporting generally like the Ni Una Menos cause really created a lot of reaction within the CNM and actually led to strengthening of this WPA to the point where it's been renamed a couple of times and has a lot more programming than it initially did. So I think there's a lot of space for these movements to create major differences, but it's something that I would like to know better during the 2000s.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Excellent. We probably have maybe time for one more question, if anyone. Yeah. Okay, Alexis, well, I would really want to thank you for taking the time to share this interesting research with us. It's a very rich project, and it sounds like there's a lot of interesting avenues for you to go forward with future research as well. So thank you all for coming, and Alexis, thank you again very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Alexis.